Welcome everyone to the Wilson Science and Technology Forum. I think it is fair to say that the Boston area has been a center for innovation and as such a major engine for economic growth and development over the years, not only in New England, but also in the United States more broadly. Today, we're going to hear from Steve Guerriero, who will extend the conversation that began in 2025 at about this time of the year, last year at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. Steve's going to describe some of what I consider to be the most remarkable exhibits and projects that recognize the Boston area's standing in regard to innovation and economic development. Steve, we're delighted to have you back with us again today, and I will turn the program over to you.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Ron and Vince, for inviting me. It's been fun hearing about your group and the interesting talks that you've been having. Like Ron said, I work at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. I'm the director of education there. We are a National Historic Landmark District, so the entire campus is the Francis Cabot Lowell Mill, where the Boston Manufacturing Company scaled the American Industrial Revolution. I, for a long time, I taught sixth grade. So if I go for too long without being interrupted with a question, I feel like something's off. So please feel free if you have any questions at all, stop me. Ron, if you monitor the chat, if anybody has a question they want to put in the chat, I'm happy to respond to those
Sure.
as well.
Will do.
So, when it's hard to pinpoint the exact beginning, of course, of the American Industrial Revolution, but what we can say is that it set the template that built the modern American economy right on the banks of the Charles River in Waltham. So I'm going to take you all the way back and maybe walk through, as a metaphor, the industrialization of time. So this is based on a talk that I gave at MIT recently, and it is kind of an interesting way to frame things, the way we think about time and the concept of time, and how that's changed from the agrarian origins of the country to our modern, hectic second by second life. So I want to take you. Oh, by the way, in the background here, you see this is the museum where I work. This is the Francis Cabot Lowell Mill complex. Here on the right, bottom right, you see the Charles River. You see our tall chimney, that's the museum. And then this building is a function of industrial archaeology, meaning you are not actually looking at one building, you're looking at several phases of additions, modifications, and essentially the progress of American industry. But I want you to focus on the left-hand bottom side where my cursor is. Can you see my cursor okay?
Yeah. Mhm.
Awesome. So this bottom part, these four stories of square windows, not counting the top story. In 1814, Francis Cabot Lowell and the Boston Manufacturing Company built a single four-story textile mill to process raw cotton into finished cloth. That is what we refer to as the world's first modern factory, the first fully integrated textile mill, and the first mill made of brick in North America. And one more first, the first place where water-powered looms were deployed in America. So this truly is a catalyzing space in American industry. Over time, within less than a year, there's a second mill built. It's behind these trees. In the 1840s, they connect the two. In the 1850s, they elongate the building. This wide building back here is post-Civil War, 1870s and 80s. A couple of outbuildings from the 1870s through the 1890s. And then my museum is the power plant built in 1911, meant to burn coal and to power a gigantic Harris Corliss steam engine that by a system of belt and line shafts would power the entire mill's machinery. So let me go way back to the beginning. So from the earliest origins of human civilization, we can understand that people have been interested in time of the day and also time across seasons. So this is one of my favorite places to share with folks when I start talking about time. This is called Nabta Playa. And it's in the desert of what is now Sudan and what was the area of Nubia on the Nile River. So if we go to about 7,000 BC, so only a few millennia before Stonehenge, we know that some very early pastoralists were bringing grazing animals to the floodplain of the Nile. Of course, through climate change, the Sahara Desert was not always the way it looks. It was at one time savanna and much more warm and temperate and wet. And so they would bring animals to a specific place that they knew seasonally would flood and they could graze. But over time, people, as they died, were buried in that place, and it took on a spiritual meaning. So this ring of stones that you see in the top right, that is a formation to track the seasons. We think it's some kind of either astronomical observatory in a similar way to Stonehenge, but more likely a solar observation apparatus that helps them understand and predict the seasonality of the Nile and of the grasses that they needed to graze their animals on. This is at a time when Egypt itself is just, very early forming in the Neolithic, from Paleolithic to Neolithic. And so we can see one of the first material remains of organized civilization is a way to keep time. So keep that in mind. I know it's a little esoteric, but humans have always been interested, and it's always been an organizing factor of our social groups. Later in Egypt, so we're now talking the 13th century BC, we see the first evidence of a sundial. So now we're trying to track hours in the course of the day. One of the things that's important to know is that, so this is already in the 13th century, so we're well past the pyramids being built, and we know that the pyramids being built required many thousands of workers and many teams of workers with a very sophisticated organization to feed and house and keep track of them. We have evidence of tokens, chips that they could trade in for food or even beer, that they had days off. And that the teams of workers even had names and competed with other teams of workers for how productive they could be. This is a massive civilizational attempt at organizing the society around work, and then that work is arranged around time. Obviously, they're not doing the dragging of stones and fine work required in the workshops at night. They are doing it during the day, and they need to track the day. And so here we see some evidence of that. If you are familiar with the very amazing pharaoh Akhenaten, who was Amenhotep the fourth, but he changed his name to Akhenaten. He worships the sun, which he calls the Aten. Seen by some folks as the first monotheistic religion. His tomb and a city that he built specifically to worship his Aten god is arranged like a sundial. So we can see that the tracking of the sun and the tracking of the hours in the course of the day has 6,000 years after Nabta Playa, we are still organizing our societies around time. Now I'm Italian, so I got to talk a little bit about Italy. So again, now we're talking in the Middle Ages, and we have predominantly Catholic Italy. The centralizing factor is the Catholic Church. This church is my grandfather's church, Santa Maria Maggiore in Montemiletto, which is in Avellino. We're talking about 40 minutes out of Naples. If you check out the bell tower, so the Italians have a phrase called campanilismo. So the campanile is the bell tower. And campanilismo is the theory that in the Middle Ages, even in early modern times, very few townspeople would wander further away from their town center than could be seen, than they could see it or hear the bell of the church. Obviously, this is an exaggeration. People are doing pilgrimage trails all over Europe. We know there's a vibrant exchange. But the idea is that that campanile, that bell tower, is a still a centralizing, organizing factor in the way that, or I should say, it's an organizing marker for the day and for the way that the society is structured. So now we have kind of the ringing of the hours. It's ecclesiastical time, but still nobody has a watch. At least most regular people don't. The clocks and watches are in a very kind of early, inaccurate, and not widespread format in this time, in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance. But so those bells are telling you not just your where the sun is in the sky, but because it's ecclesiastical time, maybe your immortal soul also depends on saying the right prayers at the right time. And so there's a an extra layer to that. And of course, there are holidays and special days of obligation when you are supposed to come to the church. It literally rings people together. Okay. And some of you may already know this, but books of hours are also really important in the Middle Ages in the Catholic religion in Western Europe, which will have an influence on early colonial settlers in North America. But it's not book of hours as in 1 hour at a time. It's marking the very specific ecclesiastic hours when you are doing the correct prayers at the right time, generally following an agrarian schedule, meaning you have sunrise, you have sunset, you have high noon, and then we're subdividing from there. So, like halfway between sunrise and noon, halfway between noon and sunset, and then in the middle of the night, the same thing. Um, these would be prayed by monasteries and churches. The bells would be rung. But you could be in one town and they could ring 3 o'clock in the morning at 3:01, and then a town a couple towns away could be ringing at 3:10 and another one at 3:12. So there's no standardization, there's approximation. But it's still an organizing factor. Okay, let's bring us a little bit closer to the history we're going to talk about. So Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, two of the framers of the U.S. Republic, they had kind of a disagreement in philosophy. I'm sure you may have heard this, but Jefferson believed that the character of the republic would be small agrarian farms, and that the backbone of American democracy would be citizen farmers. It's a little ironic, of course, if you know about Jefferson, he owned quite a massive plantation and was anything but a small citizen farmer. But he believed that that was what the future of America would be, small farms. However, Alexander Hamilton had a very different idea. First, U.S. Secretary of the Treasury believed that the future was not agrarian, the future was manufacturing. And this is from a quote, the report on the subject of manufacturers to the Speaker of the House. It's quite a famous passage, and although I don't like to read slides, I will read this one because it is very central to what we're talking about. And he says, not only the wealth, but the independence and security of a country appear to be materially connected with the prosperity of manufacturers. So he lays it out very clear and unequivocally. Every nation, with a view to those great objects, ought to endeavor to possess within itself all the essentials of national supply. These comprise the means of subsistence, habitation, clothing, and defense. And what he's saying is, at a time when we're reliant on the British to import all of our textiles, for example, and we have very little domestic manufacturing, we've gained our political independence, but we are not independent if we can't make things on our own. And this also might bring up echoes of our current kind of political discussion, let's say, around domestic manufacturing. But there is something to the idea that if the British are completely dominating our domestic markets with their imports, then they control the supply lines, which can be turned on or off. They can be disrupted. And things even that you may not think of. So we think of textiles as clothing, maybe blankets, but that also includes ship sails, and it includes army tents for Washington's army. So there is a defense and independence kind of application for having our own domestic industries. And that's what Alexander Hamilton says. So it's also ironic too. So Alexander Hamilton, the framers, the independence of America. We're celebrating the 250th last year and this year. 1775 is also the birth year of Francis Cabot Lowell, who I'll talk about momentarily. Um, Go back to about 1882. This is what the Boston Manufacturing Mill site looks like. This is the mill that I showed you at the very beginning of the slideshow. Here, where my cursor is the first mill that Francis Cabot Lowell built. What you also see is the connecting building. You see the second mill he builds in 1816, the 1850s section. This is the old power plant. This is before the building that my museum's in now. And all these buildings in the front are the descendants of Paul Moody's machine shop. So Moody Street, the Moody Street Dam, which is over here, named for Paul Moody, the first and superintendent machinist of the machine shops there. And he'll be an important factor later. So Francis Cabot Lowell, he's born, if you're from New England and you hear those two last names, if you can get it, being born a Cabot and a Lowell is actually a really good thing. So his mother is Susanna Cabot. His father is Judge John Lowell, first federal judge of New England appointed by George Washington. So the Cabot family, they have about 40 ships out of Beverly, Mass. They are traversing the entire globe with shipping. They're industrialist merchants. Huge money, elite family. The Lowells from Newburyport also are involved in shipping. And of course, Judge John Lowell and some of the other Lowells are involved in the independence movement and then the early republic, the judicial system specifically. Judge John Lowell, Francis Cabot's father, had a large estate in what is now the border between Jamaica Plain and Roxbury. Which is hard to think about now as kind of like a pastoral setting with a manor house. So Francis Cabot Lowell is a businessman through and through. He goes to Harvard University. He graduates at the age of 17 in mathematics. We know from firsthand documents there that he was brilliant, that he had a mind for math, had an engineering mind, and he also had a independence streak because we know that in the summer between a couple of his semesters, he lit an unauthorized bonfire in Harvard Yard and was punished with rustication, meaning he was sent away to the South Shore for 6 months to almost like an enforced exile. But he did graduate. Once he graduates, he in 1801 buys the largest rum distillery in the United States at the time. So he immediately buys this rum distillery. He starts to engineer the stills. So before he gets into cotton textiles, what we can see from his letters to other distillers is that he's actively involved in the engineering of the machinery. He's trying to make more rum, better quality, faster, more efficiently, and make more money doing it. And those are all things that we're going to see for his defining life's work with the Boston Manufacturing. So he goes to, so I'm going to bust a couple of myths that are fun but not true. And then I'm also going to share some unique characteristics of Lowell. I want to pause. Are there any questions that I can answer before I move into? Okay.
Two questions came to mind.
Just one thought. Was Hamilton recognized for his contribution, given that his interest in manufacturing as opposed to an agrarian structure?
Recognized. It was seen as the kind of great debate of the early United States for political philosophers of this agrarian society versus manufacturers. But I think what happens is as you get into, and once the Lowell system starts growing, there's no question but that manufacturing is really important. And the discussion morphs from that to a New England manufacturing model versus a Southern plantation and enslavement economy. And that's a very different conversation happening.
Yeah.
I had a couple of questions came to mind. One was, how did they know when to ring the bell? In terms of another, who keeps time for the timekeeper? And the second one was, where did the Lowells or the Cabots that you're talking about get that kind of money, says capitalized at $400,000 if it was $400,000 in the money in 1813, that's a huge amount
Huge.
of capital. Where did they get that?
Excellent. Yeah. So the first part is they would ring the bell. They would use things like sundials, hourglasses, even water clocks. We start to see some early clock machinery, maybe around the 1500s. Some of it is associated with, ship clocks and things like that. And so they do have a sense, but it's dependent on, in a lot of ways, the monastic lifestyle where you are, meditatively thinking minute by minute. Um, but ultimately, it's up to the person or the monk or whoever, the priest, to decide it's time to ring the bell. And we see a little echo of that in very early factories where sometimes workers are prevented from having their own watch because the company will tell you when it's lunchtime. You don't have to worry about what time it is. We'll ring the bell and then you'll know. Um,
Yeah.
and then,
Yeah.
so let me get into his money because that's an interesting story too, and one of the key innovations that Francis Cabot Lowell does. So Lowell goes to England. He has familial connections and this elite kind of New England merchant industrialist network have strong ties to the UK, both through family, kin, and just class. And so Francis Cabot Lowell has a couple of things. So he sells his rum distillery in 1806. In 1807, as you know, Napoleon is rampaging all around Europe, and the British and French both equally are harassing American ships. They are pirating them or privateering them. They are impressing some of the sailors, and it's to the point where in 1807, Thomas Jefferson and the Congress passed the Embargo Act, the embargo of 1807. And so the embargo of 1807 shuts down all trade with the UK and France. And for New England industrialists like the Lowells and the Cabots, that is an existential threat to their business, their class, and their status. And so Francis Cabot Lowell sees this happening and kind of has an understanding that this industry needs to change. I need to think of something different. In 1810, he goes to the UK, he goes to Glasgow, and a few other places in northern England and Scotland. He sees factories. He sees some of the early Cartwright looms and Arkwright spinning equipment. He sees some early water-powered equipment. At that time, a power loom was so protected as technology. You couldn't export a power loom, a drawing of one, notes about one, or even a guy who knew how to build one out of the UK. And that will factor in a few years earlier in Rhode Island when Slater the trader or Slater Mill is built using some of that technology. The myth is that Francis Cabot Lowell looked in some windows or talked to folks and memorized what he saw and then came back to the US and reconstructed from memory, piece by piece, the looms that he saw. That's absolutely not true. It's not practical and also not, it wasn't necessary because what he really saw, and we believe he went to a place called New Lanark, which was in Scotland, and it was a kind of proto-utopian mill town. He sees worker housing. There's an emphasis on hygiene and safety and quality of life, this kind of anti-Dickensian existence with the water power and the looms. What I think, and what is pretty clear from the evidence, even if Lowell didn't memorize the machinery, and by the way, they were scared of that, so they searched his ship leaving the UK and entering Canadian waters on the way home in 1811. And he understood a proof of concept. Like, this stuff can work. I can do this. We can build this. So he immediately, upon return, in 1811, 1812, he is putting together this money. So he sets up the first large-scale private company in America, first joint stock company in America with shareholders rather than a partnership. And he sets out to build the first modern factory. Couple of points of interest. It's 1812, and that might ring the War of 1812. So as hostilities are increasing, and there's a lot of disagreement with the Federalists in New England, actually, about, they call it Mr. Madison's War, who was president at the time. That war essentially shuts down all British trade. So remember, there's no domestic manufacturers at scale of anything that is imported from Britain, especially cotton textiles. And so Francis Cabot Lowell, he has the money, he has the technology, he has the idea of efficiency, he has a wide open domestic market, and he needs to act quickly. And that's exactly what he does. So he gets together with Patrick Tracy Jackson and his own family money, along with people like the Thorndikes and some of these old Brahmin families. Not all the money is capitalized at once for $400,000. Some of it is in the form of pledges, and it can be drawn upon as needed. Just as a point of scale, $400,000 not only is a huge amount of money for 1813, an actual textile mill can be built reasonably well for about $20,000 or $30,000 at the time, according to estimates. So what he's doing is building a reserve chest because he can already foresee when the market is disrupted, whether it's a panic or the resumption of British imports and dumping, I need the money to weather that storm, which the other companies and mills don't have. And that's going to be a really important war chest for him. So he goes to Waltham, and this is some of what I've already said about him, but he goes to Waltham because he establishes the Boston Manufacturing Company with these guys. And it's chartered in Boston, but the Massachusetts legislature says you can have anywhere within a 15-mile course of the Charles River the ability to establish your mill. And Waltham is 8 miles from Boston by river. And on the site of what is now our mill was John Boyce's paper mill. John Boyce was kind of tired of doing paper milling. He maybe wasn't too successful, and he was looking to sell. So right when Francis Cabot Lowell has all this money and wants to buy, he sends Patrick Tracy Jackson to Waltham, buys John Boyce's mill. The most expensive line item is the water rights for 3 years for about $5,000. Like a good cheap Brahmin, he has a yard sale with the mill equipment for the sawmill and starts accumulating the equipment for the textile mill. He buys it in 1813. By 1814, the mill is built. That's how quickly. It's the first brick mill. He has to advertise for bricks. There isn't a single supplier that can get enough bricks for this place. It's 4 stories. People would come out to Waltham to look at this place. It was such an amazing site. Here's John Boyce's mill right here. This is a woodcut, so it's a little bit in reverse, but here is the water wheel that John Boyce had the water rights for. This is called Eden Vale. This is from 1793 in Massachusetts Magazine. This is the Charles River. Got this nice little boat right here. But at that time, Waltham was completely pastoral. It was not an industrial town. And if you know about Waltham now, it's known for its industrial history now. Fast forward 1816. So this is the original mill. 4 stories. And on the cupola, you see here, it's not in this picture, but Paul Revere would be paid $97.50 for an 162-pound bell. And that bell is going to ring the workers to work and dismiss them for breakfast, lunch, and end of day. Now the workers, that's the other big innovation. Here you see this row of double-story and single-story kind of beige-colored houses. So a generation earlier, the Cabot family had the Beverly Manufacturing Company. Beverly Manufacturing Company made textiles with men and children working in the mill, and the power was by this poor draft horse that would walk in a circle all day to power the machinery until this poor thing dropped, and then they would get another one. And it went broke. George Washington visited it and said, "This is an amazing thing." And then a few years later, it went broke, and it later was disbanded. They, I wish I had evidence. I can imagine Francis Cabot Lowell's mother's cousins and uncles telling him, "Do not get into textiles. The workers are terrible. They don't know what they're doing. The children dilly-dally, and they're not good at what they do. The men leave all the time because they have other work to do in the fields. And the machinery is terrible. The horse gets sick, and it doesn't work very well. The machinery is kind of clattering." What does he do at his mill? He has new technology, those water-powered looms, and he has a new workforce. Young, unmarried women from around New England. He brings them on site. He houses them in dormitory-style housing, and they are called the mill girls. Now, the mill girls are probably the secret weapon of this place. And that's because immediately they put in an incentive. Remember that Francis Cabot Lowell's machinery is it's all prototype machinery. Paul Moody, the machinist, is experimenting with new innovations to this technology. And with any new technology, you need to have ways to test it and iterate on it and have a feedback loop that provides feedback on how it's going to inform how you're going to iterate next. So they would pay women extra if they recommended successful innovations. There was one mill girl named Mary Melvin. She grew up in Concord. She was orphaned by the War of 1812. And in 1816, she's working in this mill, the new mill. Mary Melvin is making $2.50. That's entry-level mill girl wages. She is, by 6 years later, making $12.75 a week. That is 75 cents more than the man in charge of the machine shop is making. She's the highest paid hourly employee in the entire Boston Manufacturing Company. And what we understand is that she was the one who was deploying the experimental machinery built by Paul Moody. Her knowledge was so essential. These cheap Boston Brahmins were paying her the most of any worker. She also signed for her paycheck with an X, which either is the bookkeeper checking it off, but also very well could be the fact that she couldn't read or write. In modern times now, she would be referred to as a mechanical engineer. Back then, she was called a mill girl. In 1821, the mill girls staged the first labor strike in American history. I should be careful, American industrial history. There were a couple of work stoppages in the 17th century, but in 1821, this company, Boston Manufacturing, we have a letter from a machinist to his brother saying they cut all the unmarried men's pay on payday without the slightest warning. Think about what that means. The men already did the work. Their pay is getting cut on payday. And the machinist says, this is spring of 1821, the same trick was played off on the girls, and they, as one, revolted, and the work stopped 2 days in consequence. It's the first documented American industrial labor strike, and it was the women specifically who shut the company down. Mary Melvin leaves. She marries the head of the carpentry shop. She lives the next 50 years in Waltham and never goes back to work again. I wish we had more of her story or writing or her reaction. I can only imagine as she watched this place grow for 50 years and knowing she played a key role in that first decade. Down here in the bottom left, this is a piece of folk art from Elijah Smith Jr. It's a beautiful close-up. People would come to look. Here you see the wheelhouse. The dam is over here on the left. We see the dye and storage houses, the machine shop. The staircases are bumped out from the mill in case of fire. You can still get people down from the top floors. Now our roof is flat. In the 1890s, the insurance company said this is a fire hazard, flatten the roof, and they added the fifth story. That's why it doesn't match the images here. And then all the mill girl houses back here. And here's the Charles. So,
Steve, a quick question.
Yes, please.
To get a feel for the money, a dollar in the early 19th century would be worth what now?
So it's hard to say, but that pay, $2.50 a week, was considered substantial, but particularly for the young unmarried women. The men were making more, close to $5 a week, maybe. As points of reference, we can say that, for example, when two men reported a fire that was put out early, they were given $10 in reward. We know, for example, $12 a week is what the, not Paul Moody, he's a different level, he's superintendent, but the man in charge of the machine shop is making in 1821. And I should say $2.50 a week for the mill girls. They had to pay $1.25 for rent for living in the house. So I would say a few $100s to a few $1,000. Generally, it's more about buying power than anything. For these women, also, I should say, an innovation was that they were paid in cash. So before that, they were paid in company script, which you had to use in the company store at company set prices. But because these young women were expected to send a lot of their money back home, They were paid in cash, and that gave them a level of independence. Even if they sent half their pay to rent and a bunch of the money back home to their fathers, they could still buy a new outfit. We know that the company spent $500 on a lending library for their employees in the first year of existence, which was quite progressive. And so I think for the American industrial worker in these early days, it's a subsistence living. The amount of money is not anything that's going to bring you from one class to the next class. Um, good question. Any other questions that I can answer while I? All right, great. So, um, we also know that there's this hybrid time. So many of these young women are coming from New England farms. So think again of Jefferson's idea of small farming. They, on the family farm, are on agrarian time. Sunrise comes up, you're going to do your farm chores, feed the animals, collect the eggs, take care of the cows, and you can do that until sunset. And maybe at high noon, especially in the summer, you're going to take a break, eat lunch, something like that. But these women now who are working in the factory, the first modern factory in the world, they're now being paid hourly. And time is literally money now. And so we need a way to track their hours, and we need a way to make sure that we build in kind of a sustainable day, although not sustainable for us. But the main schedule for mill girls, 4:40 a.m. wake up, 5 a.m. be on site ready to work, 30 minutes at 7 for breakfast, 40 minutes at 12 for lunch. By the way, that's travel time back and forth to the mill girl housing where the dorm mothers, matrons would cook for them and run back and then work till sundown. So in the summer, we're talking like maybe 8:30, 9 p.m. In the winter, maybe 4:30 p.m. This is 6 days a week. This is, of course, we're going to church on Sunday. And they also are hiring, this is one of the first company provided schools. So they're bringing in lecturers to educate the girls and the machinists. And eventually they'll open it up to anyone in Waltham who wants to attend. So these are in the years before Horace Mann, the Boston Manufacturing Company is providing free schooling. Which is interesting because the philosophy of paternalism set by Francis Cabot Lowell is that educated workers are better innovators. So if they're educated, they're going to be better problem solvers. They're going to be more efficient workers for us. And so it's to our advantage to educate them. That $500 for the lending library becomes what will be the Waltham Public Library. The schools will be the public school system. The reward for the fire alert people, we're talking about the first fire department in Waltham. So there's a direct correlation between what we assume are municipal services that start out as corporate provided services that then are subsumed by the city once we get into the late 19th century. Even like
Steve,
the, yes, go ahead.
there were mill girls rather than
Yes.
mill men because the men were expected to work in the fields of the farms. Is that correct? Or what was the reason why they were chosen?
So the girls were seen as underutilized in the small farm economy. So men and boys would be doing the outside work, the
Yeah.
plowing and things like that, and then the women, the moms of the house, would be doing things like weaving and the domestic care. And the young women were seen as not as useful. And remember, at the factory, we have the mill girls who are doing this textile work with the looms and the spinning wheels and things like that. But the men are building the machinery. And so the men are doing the work in the machine shop, which
Yeah.
is just as substantial and robust as the mill girl workforce. And very quickly, the idea was that the women would make some money and go back and get married with a dowry. Very quickly, we see mill girls and machinists with the same last name picking up one another's paychecks. So the population of Waltham grows quickly, and it soon becomes apparent that many of the mill girls are staying and that are starting their families away from their original homes.
Yeah, I guess what struck me is the large number, 7 or 8 thousand young women. That's a lot of people. Were there a similar number of men working in the system?
Yeah, yeah. So this is a little bit later. The first mill in the time of Francis Cabot Lowell, we're talking a couple hundred, and then it will eventually grow to a couple thousand throughout the 19th century. And yes, the short answer is there. I mean, there are supervisors who are men. There are machinists who are men. They're also all kind of like the ancillary kind of suppliers. So we have like, somebody has to make nails.
Yeah.
Somebody has to repair the dam. Somebody has to build the outbuildings. And so all of these are kind of an ecosystem around the mill that have kind of like this. If the mill is the bullseye, that surround the industry and feed it. And actually, we'll see that in the same model with the Waltham Watch Company. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah,
it,
I'm just wondering, where did they get their material from, the textiles? Was it from the South? And did that build up the South as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we actually have in the very first books, so all of the ledger books of the Boston Manufacturing Company are at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School. And then Francis Cabot Lowell and the Lowell family's papers are in the Massachusetts Historical Society. And so we can trace that. And we know that even though they are using brokers in places like New Orleans, there is an absolute direct proportional relationship between the growth of Boston manufacturing and the New England cotton textile industry and the enslavement economy. We can follow the growth of New England textile manufacturing and the expansion of slavery from Georgia to Alabama to Mississippi to Louisiana. And so, you already probably know Eli Whitney in Massachusetts, is involved in firearms, and then later, the cotton gin is kind of supercharging this enslavement incentive economy, and that's absolutely powering the mill. It's the only reason he can buy the cheap cloth, or sell the cheap cloth, sorry, and buy the cheap products from the South. And most of the cloth is re-imported to the American South. So it actually takes on the name Lowell cloth, and this is a quote, Negro cloth, which is given by plantation owners to their enslaved workers to use as clothing. There's a great scholar out of Brown University named Seth Rockman who just wrote a book last year called Plantation Goods. And he traces this economy through things like shoes and clothing from New England, powering the enslavement economy with its goods down in the South.
Hmm.
Um, and so Francis Cabot Lowell, one important piece, which is he builds the mill in 1814. This is in the midst of the War of 1812. In 1815, the war is settled. So Francis Cabot Lowell can already see that the British imports that have been stacking up back in the UK are now, and the British, of course, are bringing it from India and Southeast Asia, things like that, are stacking up so much that they're about to dump and drop the floor in the market, and will basically kill all of the nascent domestic mass manufacturing. So what does he do? He immediately, first of all, in the December of, I think it's the day after Christmas, 1815, he organizes a meeting in Dedham of all of the local cotton producers. And he says, we need a political campaign to get the government to protect our industry that we are working so hard to build. And so then he actually goes to Washington, D.C. He is arguing with folks like Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, and he's getting the cotton producing states and the New England industrialist politicians to agree we need the government to protect our industry. And what comes out of it is the first protective tariff in American history, the Tariff of 1816, specifically to protect the cotton industry in New England that's in danger from British dumping. Ironically, he's already selling his stuff so cheaply, the tariff isn't really needed for his own business. What he wants to do is protect the entire industry. And he sees that if the industry is healthy, my business is going to be healthy. And so that tariff is actually a fundamental instrument in the early republic to kind of have the government involved in business. And again, echoes of that happening now in our current political dialogue around protection from foreign imports. Francis Cabot Lowell dies in 1817. He's only 42 years old. He's pretty sickly. We don't really know what's going on with him. He has like these certain kind of health trips that he makes, probably on the advice of doctors. So he's not in town in Waltham in 1817 when President James Monroe, newly elected, visits. And we know that James Monroe comes through Waltham, and we know that he visits the Boston manufacturing mills. And there's this great story that comes later that I wish I had the primary source of. But James Monroe was known for being tall and elegant, and he ushers in what's later called the era of good feelings. The war is over, and things are feeling good. The economy's booming. And the story is that the mill girls line the aisles of the mill. And as James Monroe tours through, they're all kind of gawking at him. And he says, this place is amazing. He says, this place could satisfy the entire cotton textile market in the United States. Of course, an exaggeration, but it gives you a sense of like what the conversation is like. Francis Cabot Lowell dies in 1817, but his business continues for another 100 years, which speaks to the system that he put in place. Joint stock company, so shares can be bought and sold very easily and transferred, especially when one of the owners dies. It can be recapitalized. Patrick Tracy Jackson, who is his brother-in-law, is the CEO of the company. Patrick Tracy Jackson is a brilliant, kind of, I think, understudied figure in the early American Industrial Revolution. He is a founding member of the first commercial railroad. He's involved in insurance companies, but his biggest legacy is that around 1820, 21, when that strike happens, they have completely exhausted the potential energy of the Charles River. If you've ever seen the Charles River in the summer, you can walk across it and not get your knees wet. And so that energy is completely the capacity of the mill. They are limited by what they can produce in energy. And so they already start to think, what else can we do? We have this amazing, successful model. We just don't have enough energy. So they're looking around. There's some stories about how exactly, but they go up to the Merrimack River in East Chelmsford in an area called Pawtucket Falls. Coincidentally, Patrick Tracy Jackson's father-in-law owns some of the properties around there. But Boston Manufacturing charters what will be called the Proprietors of Locks and Canals, which will be a holding company for the Merrimack Manufacturing Company. And that Merrimack Manufacturing Company will have a license with Boston Manufacturing for something like $1 for all of their patents and equipment. And the machine shop in Waltham will build equipment for this new Merrimack Manufacturing Company. And I should say, the Boston Manufacturing is making money not just from the textiles they produce. In fact, I would argue the licensing and the building of machinery for other cotton mills is just as critical to their business model. Within 6 months of launching, they're already in patent infringement lawsuits, being sued and suing others. And so that shows you the kind of intellectual property aspect of it is directly, involved right at the inception of what's happening. And so fast forward, you may have already kind of gleaned this, but they take this and they multiply it by 10 because the Merrimack River is about 10 times more powerful than the Charles. The Pawtucket Falls is an incredible amount of energy they can harness. Proprietors of Locks and Canals harnesses that energy through a series of locks and gates and dams, and they establish what will become a huge physical plant of mills like the boot mill. And they name it for their deceased friend Lowell. And so the city of Lowell is a spin-off of what happens in Waltham, not just inspired by it, but a direct corporate spin-off of the Boston Manufacturing Company in Waltham. And right from that point, from the 1820s, the center of gravity immediately shifts from Waltham to Lowell. So Paul Moody moves to Lowell. Now he's in charge of the Lowell machine shop. And many of the mill girls, we think, maybe move up there or train the mill girls up there. But the scale of things in Lowell, and then later Lawrence, and then Holyoke, Springfield, Manchester, New Hampshire, all of these places are modeled after what happens. Very quickly, we got the railroads. Patrick Tracy Jackson instrumental in putting in place the Fitchburg line. And immediately we have kind of this massive supercharging of industrialization and urbanization. And that's directly correlated to what happens in Waltham, scaling up in Lowell, and then being copied throughout New England, and then throughout what they called the West, what we would call now the Midwest. So as westward expansion happens after the War of 1812, they're importing this idea all the way back to Hamilton. Manufacturing is the future, not small agrarian existence. And I think I've already spoken a couple of about the mill girls. This is a later kind of 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century pictures of women. I will point out in the back, you see the man, the supervisor back there, keeping an eye. Notice all the girls have their hair tied up very tight. We're talking about belt and line shaft machinery. So we have reports of women being scalped by the machines. That we know the women are responsible for 1, then 2, then 4, then 8, then up to 32 machines for one woman to supervise. You can't just shut down the line. So they learn things like knots to tie while if a string breaks while the machines are still running to quickly repair the thread. Very early in 1836, Boston Manufacturing in Waltham is deploying a steam engine, one of the first industrial steam engines deployed because they use it for supplementary power. In post-Civil War, now we're going primarily steam. And then in the early 20th century, we have steam-generated electricity with GE generators. The steam equipment, we know that in our place, we had a Harris Corliss steam engine, but that was powered by coal. But one thing, again, like back to that cheap New England efficiency, in 1902, we know that they're still using the water turbines. They're still using direct water power from the Charles because we have wheel pit reports of surveyors that they hired to clean out and replace the water wheels. They have 39-inch, they're called Hercules water wheels, 3 of them, still underneath the building, still powering the mill because that water keeps flowing. It's free. So why am I going to pay for extra coal when I can have my original water wheel still going? And to answer your question, none of the machinery doesn't exist anymore. The only remnants of Boston Manufacturing is the buildings themselves, which have been highly modified. The mill itself is now senior low-income housing. The founder of our museum, Michael Brewster Folsom, was an MIT teacher. He would bring students out to that site and tell you all the things that I just told you over the course of this session. And he had heard in the 70s, as you probably know from New England, cities like Lowell, Lawrence, Holyoke, Haverhill, these mill towns in the 60s and 70s were in collapse. It was urban decay. And these mills were in the center of the town. So when the industry of an industrial town leaves, the whole town is threatened. And that was the case in Waltham. And in Waltham, the idea was to tear down the mill. It was derelict. Some of it was open to the air and the elements. Michael Folsom worked for 3 years to get it on the National Historic Register. That unlocked HUD loans to repair and refurbish the building into senior low-income apartments. And the National Endowment for the Humanities grant was the seed money for the museum itself. And the museum is not just a textile museum. And again, back to our idea of time, there was a whole culture around this industry. The women started the Lowell Offering, first publication primarily by women for women readers. Original tales. Some people think, we know Charles Dickens visited Lowell, that he got the idea for A Christmas Carol from a ghost story that he read in the Lowell Offering. They would talk about the tyranny of the bell that ruled their lives, told them when to eat, when to leave, when to wake up. Here's the letter, they as one revolted. That's the documentation of the work stoppage. And here's the legal agreement between the Boston and Merrimack manufacturing companies. So the whole system of holding companies, like, Alphabet owns Google and kind of the way that we structure our corporate structure today, it's a direct through line from what Francis Cabot Lowell and the Boston Associates, Patrick Tracy Jackson, what they built and the template they set, that what's followed now. So you have workers doing the work on the line, supervisors and management running the company. and the shareholders capitalizing and profiting and owning the company, and that those companies can be owned by other companies, this kind of interlocking board of director network. And here you see Lowell. So the Merrimack Manufacturing Company has just a huge amount of mills, and the proprietors of locks and canals doesn't directly own all of these mills. What they do is set up a business model where they license the power from the river. So they dominate the flow of the river, and they can rent to you certain amounts of power through the canal system, so that they don't need to own the production. Now they own the energy. And again, we're talking about data centers, and we're talking about the war in Iran, and we're talking about, the Strait of Hormuz. The economic prosperity of America, the industrial prosperity of America, directly correlated to its availability of energy to power that. Just as relevant in 1840 as it is in 2026. So I'll fast forward. You can give me, how we're doing on time or anything. I'm happy to fast forward or slow down. But this is a view of Waltham. Now we have the train. We have the Waltham Gas Works, the gaslight company specifically founded to light up the mill with gaslights. We have the bleachery, which is where much later, after the bleachery goes out of business, the Raytheon will take over the space. Up in Maynard, for example, Digital Equipment Company, will be in the Maynard textile mill. So again, like we have this kind of iteration of industry in America. This is the Moody Street Dam. This is one of my favorites. It's a steamboat called the White Swan that would bring passengers from Moody Street all the way up to the area of Norumbega Park in Riverside in Newton. And you could pay a quarter for a round trip in around 1880 to go up to see the shows in Norumbega or do some canoeing up at Riverside Park. Here we have a full complex. This spur is the Bemis line. And the owners of the company originally heard the railroad was going to put in across town, and they said, no, you're not. We are on your board, and we're going to tell you you're going to have a spur into our campus, and we'll tell you where we want the railroad. Happen to be right next to the factory campus. And then we have a series of interlocking businesses. The company, so the bleachery that I had spoken about, we're making cotton textiles. The idea of having a clean white shirt was a status symbol. If you could afford in the 1820s to have a white shirt, that was a big deal because it was a lot to clean it. And so sun bleaching at first, and then later the bleachery is set up not just for Waltham-based Boston manufacturing cloth, but now they start to license other companies' cloth. They sun bleach, and then later by the 1830s, the Newton Chemical Works is established. And imagine working in this environment. They take sulfur and distill it into sulfuric acid, oil of vitriol. And that is then sent to the bleachery to bleach the fabrics. Nasty stuff. They're using lead and platinum retorts. They have a system called lead distillation, where they have this weird kind of chamber where they would boil the sulfur and then redistill it into this concentrated, nasty, nasty stuff. But all of this is happening at once. The bleachery is built. The chemical works is built. They own vast tracts of land. All these companies are building worker housing. Later, Waltham Watch Company will also be involved across town in this kind of thing. Here's Waltham Watch. You know Waltham is Watch City? It's not an accident that Aaron Dennison in the 1850s moves his factory building pocket watches from Roxbury in Boston, where the dusty roads are interfering with the actual precision machining. And he goes out to Waltham, where it's still generally pretty pastoral, woodsy kind of, you have the Boston manufacturing downriver, but the Waltham Watch Company is built as it is the first to do precision machining at factory scale. It's the first. There's a direct through line from what Waltham Watch Company is doing to the digital age. So the Waltham Watch Company is built with big high windows so that the workers can see what they're doing, because now we're doing little precision machining. They directly deploy assembly line work with specialized lines doing specialized work and interchangeable parts. So Abraham Lincoln's William Ellery pocket watch that he gets, If it breaks and a part needs to be replaced, Waltham watch can take one part, put it in, no matter what the model is, and they'll know it works. And so this is a massive upgrade. We know in the 1950s, Henry Ford's grandson told the New York Times, my grandfather, Henry Ford, got the idea for an assembly line from visiting Waltham Watch. And people say it was because of a Chicago meat packing plant. And his grandson specifically says that's not true. It's his visit to Waltham Watch. And we also know Henry Ford was a watchmaker before he got into automobiles. And so Waltham Watch in the 1870s, the largest contiguous indoor space in the world, right here on the banks of the Charles River. Waltham Watch is also incredibly precise in what they do, pumping out massive amounts of pocket watches. And if you remember, now we're a long way from church bells. Now everybody has a watch in their pocket. In fact, if you have a pair of jeans, that fifth pocket on the right side, the little pocket, is your pocket watch pocket. So Levi Strauss is building that into his pants for you to have your pocket watch. Those pocket watches also presage things like fuses and timers. Waltham Watch in World War I and II are making very precise munition timers, depth gauges, instrumentation. We are getting ready to deploy an exhibit next month because in 1916, Waltham Watch bought Nikola Tesla's patent for a frictionless speedometer. So we have in our collection unpublished, unpublicized, handwritten correspondence from Nikola Tesla to Waltham Watch. And if you know about Nikola Tesla, this will be funny to you. He's complaining he's not getting paid enough. He needs more money. I licensed you my patent and I need more money. And Waltham Watch saying back to him, we're not selling enough. From like 1920 to about 1930, Nikola Tesla's speedometer is a luxury upgrade for Packards, Cadillacs, and Rolls Royces. And these documents have never been widely distributed and seen. They're an amazing collection. But what they do show is that, when Nikola Tesla had his patent for a frictionless speedometer, a pocket watch company was the correct manufacturing plant to actually make these incredibly intricate, precise instrumentation. So even Waltham Watch goes from 1850 to 1950. In 1950, they can't keep up with the Swiss for a few reasons. The Swiss get better. They have an industrial espionage campaign to steal some intellectual property, mostly by getting some of the workers drunk and paying them. And also the Van der Waard screw machine that can make 60,000 pocket watch screws a day. They are getting much better. And also, Waltham Watch was always considering wrist watches for women. Pocket watches were for men. And the Swiss were thinking, no, big fancy bracelet watches are a luxury item for men. And so Waltham wasn't able to keep up. And at the end of World War II, the contracts from the government dropped and they went broke. But some of the women back to the textile mills and the Waltham Watch Factory who had been doing this precise, incredibly dexterous work, repetitive, super amount of patience required, are contracted by Raytheon in Waltham to hand wire all of the memory core of the Apollo space hardware. So they were referred to as the little old ladies of Waltham. Sadly, we don't know a lot of their identities. This is actually even worse. In the Raytheon newsletters, it was not unheard of for the women to be too old or not attractive enough, so they would take secretaries they thought were more attractive and pose them with these women's work to illustrate what was happening. So one of the core jobs that I have is to try and find more of these women and their descendants to tell their story. But that's the direct connect. They're hand wiring computer memory. So from pocket watches to the digital age, we literally have a generational connection. It's not esoteric and it's not kind of inspirational. It's a direct manufacturing connection. It's not an accident. Boston Dynamics are building robots on 128 in Waltham. It's because this foundation was laid by Waltham Watch Company. And so all of these robotics, these high tech, that's why we're doing our Tech Pioneers project, talking to people like Mitch Kapor and Ray Stata and Sherwin Greenblatt of Bose All of these folks coming out of MIT, they are directly correlated to this kind of electronics work that comes out of the mechanical work of Waltham Watch. And then we have the rise of the industrial middle class. And one of the ways we like to illustrate that in the museum, we have a collection of 125-year-old historical canoes. Why canoes? We had three canoe manufacturers just in Waltham because now people have a weekend, speaking of time and schedules. Now they have a little extra spending money. They are spending most of their time in corporate plants. And so they're not interested in going into the city. They're interested in going out to the river and to enjoy in a time before mass manufacture of cars. This is the way you meet your date. You could do a little canoodling out in the canoe, and there's not enough room for a chaperone. We know the Newton police arrested something like 31 people between 1901 and 1904 for inappropriate activity in a canoe. I don't know why it's an odd number. I'll leave that to your imagination. But we do know that it was a central organizing social point for people to enjoy recreation on the same river that was powering all of the precision machinery at Waltham Watch and the textile machinery at Boston Manufacturing. And I'll just wrap up by saying here's Abraham Lincoln's William Ellery pocket watch. The
Hmm.
Waltham Watch Company goes defunct in the 1950s. Some of the companies that supplied Waltham Watch, like Bird Precision, they're still around. So they were making precise pieces, implements that were used in the pocket watches. They still exist. So this precision machining is still around. Boston Manufacturing is less of a happy ending. They, in the 1920s, are in a tough way. The American textile industry in New England starts to move south. It's not an accident that the 1920s are an unprecedented wave of organized labor strikes. So you have organized labor. Waltham Watch Company in 1924 has what they call the monster strike, where 70% of the workers come off the line. Um, but cheaper labor, being closer to the production of cotton, has the owners of Boston Manufacturing liquidate the company in 1929, not because of the crash, but because of a decade of decline. And then very quickly, just as they were the first to industrialize, Boston Manufacturing is one of the first to go down and set the template for the collapse of industrial towns. Like I said, Lowell, Lawrence, Holyoke, Springfield, Manchester, New Hampshire, Biddeford, Maine, all of them experienced this massive decline to the south, the American South, then offshore to the Caribbean. And now most of our cotton textiles come from Southeast Asia or South Asia, like Bangladesh, all in pursuit of cheaper labor, closer to the production, the natural resources, and also easier regulatory environments as well. And so, again, like I mentioned, DEC, Digital Equipment, if some of you remember them, or Wang Computer. Wang starts in Lowell. DEC is in the Maynard Mill. And so these new tech companies being started by people coming out of World War II and the RAD lab, if you know the radiation laboratory in MIT, they are going into these old spaces and building a brand new technology, a brand new industry. The Software Council, the Massachusetts Software Council, is the first of its kind in the nation. And just like Francis Cabot Lowell wanted government policy to protect his industry, now the Software Council is looking to the state or the Commonwealth and the federal government to protect and nurture and support its industry, digital technology and software. And so I think that probably will bring us to a conclusion. But I would love to see, here's a Vanderwood screw machine. I would love to see if there are any more
Yeah.
questions or anything I can address that I've said.
Yeah. Why don't we stop the screen share and we'll take questions for a
Sure
few minutes?
thing. Absolutely.
Um, it's sort of an interesting history of kind of the rise and fall of industries, but it's the process, it's the mindset that is important. And you look at the steel industry in the United States as opposed to the textile industry. Steel just grew and grew and grew, and then all of a sudden, there are virtually no integrated steel makers in the United States today. There are pe people melting, remelting scrap steel,
Yep.
But if you're trying to build for example, a new nuclear reactor, you used to be able to find a supplier of the steel reactor vessels in the U.S. They don't exist anymore. It's just a progression, and that, in a way, a natural progression. Part of it stimulated by the absence of, in my judgment, poor judgment on the part of some of the leadership
Hmm.
of the companies. But that's another story. We don't get too far into it. Let me ask if there are any questions or comments anyone would like to make. First, let me thank you, Steve. That was just a wonderful perspective on the importance of New England and the Lowells and so on in the evolution of the American economy, and particularly the textile economy. Any questions from any of our crew?
Hmm.
Eddie.
Yes, I couldn't help noticing that the Nubia sundial seemed to be split into, there were 13 lines, and I'm wondering if there were 12 lines actually that were used, and that's part of where we got. I know Mesopotamia and so forth had something to do with our way we do clock hours,
Hmm.
but I wondered if that seemed to be running through from that time.
Do you know, that's a great question, and I know like the 12 is related to the uh Babylonian numbering system. This is the sundial is Egyptian from the 13th dynasty, so we're talking, well after the Babylonian numbering system, the base 60 system is established. I don't know specifically where that amount of time or that division of time comes from, except that there's strong evidence. For example, he builds his city, the city to the Aten, as in that exact format. So you have his tomb as the central point, and then this semicircle that radiates out. I don't know if it's more manageable because of that division, but yeah, it's a good question. I am actually not certain about exactly where that comes from specifically.
Yeah. John.
This is very interesting because last week I was in Washington, D.C., and I went to Smithsonian. I went to only one exhibit at the Smithsonian, which was the bottom of the 8 levels in the National Museum of African American History and Culture,
Mm.
which covered from the beginning of the slave trade through the Civil War. And that's where I learned about Eli Whitney, Cotton Gin, and the mills up here, and how that um, supercharged
Hmm.
the slave trade in the South.
Yep.
That the slaves became very valuable because they became, there was a very big market for the cheap cotton that was
Mm.
enabled by the cotton gin. And I mean, this is exactly everything you said about the Lowell cloth. They said it was called the Lowell cloth.
Hmm.
That the slaves got Lowell cloth to make their own clothing.
Hmm.
That had been a problem before because uh, before the textiles and everything, a lot of the work of the slaves was just to make their own clothes.
Yes. In
Uh,
fact, Seth Rockman's book, Plantation Goods, he talks about it was purposefully the case that these clothes were meant to be completely worn out so that every 6 months when they present the clothes, there was almost this either ceremonial kind of attitude around the presentation of this new cloth, as if there's some sort of beneficence happening, like, here's your new cloth that we're giving you. And that was an established kind of ritual of the plantation owners.
so anyway, it was so interesting because it was like 1 week ago today that I learned about this at the Smithsonian, and now you're completely verifying it in exactly the same words as in the exhibits there.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm in good company. The folks
Yeah.
there do great work. Absolutely.
All right, let's go to Vincent. Thanks, John.
Yes, Ron, you see why I introduced Tom and you to the museum.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes.
And Steve has gone on to expand the education, public education. The intriguing thing here, in several ways, is that you learn something of social policy as the side mechanism by which economic advance was made without regard necessarily to actual family structure. So the mill girls are altering agrarian farm family structure,
Hmm.
Yeah,
creating a new social class that is barely middle class. A lot of other issues even today. And it points to the fact that Massachusetts, too often we say, oh, that's just something we do here and we export and other people do, but it's still centrally driven here.
Hmm.
When Governor Healy talks about, for certain categories, giving people free community college education,
Hmm.
when we serially, from Deval Patrick through Governor Healy, and perhaps in the future talk about the state helping economic business. These are important things, and it points to, as some of us, Ron and I, have been talking a little bit about and doing some programming, the sociology and the civics of local communities, and we underestimate sometimes the good, bad, and negative, and even neutral effects of what we do here. And this is where the bringing back of civics into our curriculum is important, but
Mm.
more importantly, understanding economics as something that just happens as business goes forward, and we need to be a little bit more mindful, as the clergy might say, not to impose a view, but to share the incredible wealth and resources that we continue to generate here. To this day, inertial guidance for the space program is
yeah,
done in connection with
Yep.
Lincoln Laboratories. Think
Hmm.
about landing on Mars or traveling beyond as being a product of Massachusetts in part, uh, leading, and that's the crucial
Hmm.
part.
yeah,
What do we do as leaders? What do we do as ethicists? What do we do as philosophers, understanding that ultimately we all live daily lives,
Hmm.
but how the wealth that funds that is unique in many ways still to Massachusetts and to the United States.
And it is like the case which I didn't get into. There are so many other Waltham innovative kind of industries. We think like Polaroid, for example, starts in Cambridge, but Edwin Land builds the giant plant out in Waltham. GTE, Sylvania Electric, like these plants were cutting edge
yeah,
in terms of their technology and in terms of the innovation work that was happening. And the public policy, the whole 128 innovation belt. In our museum, we have a early 1950s folder of stuff from Cabot, and Forbes building the first large-scale corporate campuses along 128 once the Eisenhower highway system is built. It wasn't by accident, it was on purpose, and they were modeled after college campuses. So the idea was we have a central green, we have all these buildings around with cutting edge kind of lifestyle features that bring all these people from the different greater Boston suburbs into a single place. And we kind of create the crackling energy that you find, in Kendall Square at MIT, but we do it in Waltham or Reading or Stoneham or, any of the towns up and along 128.
yeah,
And towards the final part of this, as we look forward to next year, I believe we have a programming committee coming up,
yeah, that's right.
and we should explore this just a little bit more,
Yeah,
because this is at once actually kind of exciting when you think about it. And we don't have to go somewhere to do something that's happening just incredibly, but also how do we position ourselves and in fact perform public policy, inform the legislatures. This is PBS quality stuff. Dare I say, Steve, may even be MacArthur Fellow type material.
yeah,
This is the kind of material that if every child growing up in Massachusetts learned and understood the economic demographic There's just so much more to be done. I don't want to filibuster this. Pretty soon, Ron will call it a Vincebuster.
Well, it is appropriate that you have the last comment today, Vincent, because the next presentation and the final one for this season on June 26th is going to be given by Vincent, and it's on the preparations for the 250th anniversary celebrations in the Boston area. So we'll
And
be
and 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 as a closing PS, I came across a 150th anniversary speech
Ooh,
of Governor Calvin Coolidge, now president, that some people at the time thought was the best statement of what it meant to be an American and the values and the sense of sharing that we're struggling with these very days. Thank you very much for Ron for listening to my little bit to go visit an obscure site that's not so obscure.
yeah,
That is really quite important. And thank you for everyone on this message. We should do a little more marketing to get this out because more people need to hear this.
yeah, you're right.
Thank you.
Steve, I want to thank you on behalf of the forum for joining us today. You gave us a really wonderful perspective on all of this, from the evolution to the demise to the future, and we appreciate it. Thank you so much. We're going to
Thank
have
you.
to bring this group somehow to the museum someday.
I was gonna say,
Maybe we can have dinner there, sir.
I want
Yeah,
everybody to feel welcome. Come to the
yeah,
museum, come to Waltham. Let me know if you're coming, and I would love to meet up and show you around the museum itself.
you're on, kid.
Great.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
All right, have a good
everyone.
weekend, everybody.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
You bet. Take
Bye-bye.
care.